You don't start as a spy. You start as someone who can be shaped into one. That's the first Cold War truth. Intelligence doesn't begin with action. It begins with paperwork, interviews, quiet tests, and a person in a plain office deciding whether your mind is stable enough to live in two worlds at once. You're noticed because you're useful. You speak a language without thinking about it. You can sit in silence without needing to fill it. You remember small details other people drop. You don't drink too much. You don't brag. You don't panic when someone stares too long. So you're invited in, and you enter at the lowest rank. A trainee. This is where the romance dies early. Training is not a montage. It is repetition until your instincts are replaced. You learn how to keep your face neutral while your stomach drops. How to talk like you belong in a place you've never belonged. How to carry fear without showing it. How to tell a lie that sounds like a memory. They teach you tradecraft, but mostly they teach you restraint. Don't write things down. Don't say names. Don't trust convenience. Don't build habits. Don't fall in love with your cover story. And the lesson underneath every lesson is simple. You are not being trained to win fights. You are being trained not to exist. If you pass, you become a junior officer. Now you're posted somewhere that looks normal if you don't know how to look. An embassy, a cultural office, a trade delegation, a press desk. A place where people shake hands and pretend the Cold War is a disagreement about economics instead of a contest to see who can ruin the other side without starting a nuclear war. At this level, your job is not secrets. Your job is contact. You attend receptions where everyone smiles too much. You drink bad wine under bright lights and learn to recognize the sound of monitored rooms, the slight pause before a laugh, the way people angle their bodies to block lip reading, the way a harmless question lands like a probe. You learn to spot loneliness. Not because you feel sorry for it, because loneliness is an opening. If you perform well, you become a spotter. This is the rank nobody writes movies about because it looks like nothing. You identify potential sources. You study people who do not know they are being studied. A bored engineer, a resentful clerk, a junior officer passed over for promotion, a scientist who wants his work recognized, a translator who hears everything and is treated like furniture. You don't approach them like targets. You approach them like accidents. A conversation that just happens, a shared cigarette, a helpful comment, a small kindness. You make yourself feel safe. That is your first real weapon. And slowly you learn the dirty mathematics of recruitment. Everyone believes they are immune to being used until someone touches the right pressure point. Ideology, money, ego, romance, revenge, fear. You don't need a perfect person. You need a person with access and a crack. Then you move up again. Case officer. Now you run agents. Not the glamorous kind. Not men in tuxedos swapping microfilm on bridges. Mostly ordinary people who hate their bosses, need money, want meaning, or think they're smarter than the system they serve. You handle them like fragile machinery. Too much pressure and they break. Too little and they drift. You schedule meetings in safe, forgettable places. You talk in circles because direct language is a trap. You teach them just enough to function and not enough to improvise. You tell yourself you are protecting them, but you also know the truth. If they are caught, you will be denied. You do not betray them. The structure was built that way from the start. This is the rank where your conscience starts changing shape. Because you're not stealing secrets with your own hands. You're turning a human being into a pipeline. You're teaching someone to lie to their spouse, their coworkers, their country, and eventually their own sense of self. And when they hesitate, you don't threaten them. You remind them of the money already taken, of the promises already made, of the first document already passed. You make the door behind them feel locked. If you survive long enough, you become a senior case officer. Now your assignments are heavier. Higher level sources, denied cities, operations where being wrong doesn't mean embarrassment. It means prison, a staged confession on television, or a car accident nobody investigates. At this level, paranoia stops being a feeling. It becomes policy. You assume your phone is monitored because it is. You assume your hotel room is searched because it is. You assume the friendly attaché is hostile intelligence because he might be. You assume your best agent could be doubled because that is how this game is played. You learn to live without certainty, and you begin to understand something most civilians never will. In the Cold War, there is no clean truth. There is only usable truth. If your agency trusts you, you get a different kind of promotion. You become an illegal, deep cover. No embassy protection. No diplomatic immunity. No official story anyone will admit to. You live as someone else for so long that you becomes a private language you almost stop speaking. You carry loneliness like a second spine. You make friends you cannot fully keep. You date someone who will never know what you are. You attend birthdays, funerals, holidays, and you're always slightly outside the moment watching yourself perform normalcy. Your job is not action. Your job is endurance. Because the longer you last, the more valuable you become. A year is impressive. 5 years is rare. 10 years makes you a ghost with a pension. But ghosts still leave tracks. A hesitation in the wrong conversation. A neighbor who watches too closely. A routine walk taken one time too many. A border stamp that doesn't match a story. A single careless contact that reveals you have a life you shouldn't. At this rank, you don't fear gunfire. You fear the knock. Not the loud knock. The polite one. If you rise from that, you don't become safer. You become responsible. Station chief. Now you run a whole city. Not the city itself. The hidden version of it. The networks, the assets, the cutouts, the safe apartments, the compromised officials, the liaison relationships that exist only until someone decides they are inconvenient. You manage officers who think they're clever and agents who think they're brave. You approve operations that will ruin lives if they succeed and ruin more lives if they fail. You decide what to report upward and what to bury, because headquarters doesn't need facts, it needs clarity. And clarity is always a choice. At this level, you learn the most bitter rule in intelligence. The truth doesn't rise to the top. The story does. Then you're pulled out of the field. Headquarters. Now you become a desk chief, a division head, a man in suits and secure rooms reading cables that smell like someone else's fear. You sit under fluorescent lights and decide which risks are acceptable for people whose faces you will never see. You brief politicians who want certainty you cannot provide. You shape assessments so they'll be heard. You watch careers rise and fall on whether a report supports what leadership already decided to believe. You start speaking in careful language. Likely. Unconfirmed. High confidence, low confidence, sources indicate. You learn that ambiguity is not weakness. It's armor. Because if you are wrong in this building, you don't die. You are reassigned. You are blamed. You are protected by your network, or you are sacrificed to protect someone above you. Now, finally, you reach the top, director. This is where the spy becomes an institution. You sit in rooms where national decisions are made, and you bring secrets like offerings. You authorize operations you will deny later. You sign off on things that will never appear in records until decades pass and historians argue about what really happened. You tell elected leaders what they need to know. You decide what they don't. You justify it the way every director justifies it. Not because you hate democracy, but because you believe some truths would break it. Or because you've lived in shadows so long that you no longer trust anything that happens in daylight. By this rank, you are no longer fighting the enemy. You are fighting time, politics, scandal, budgets, and the constant risk that one exposed operation will collapse public trust in the entire machine. And you begin to realize the final Cold War irony. You spent your life preventing catastrophe. But the methods you use would look like catastrophe if anyone saw them clearly. So, what was it like to be every rank of spy in the Cold War? As a trainee, you were built. As a junior officer, you learned to blend. As a spotter, you learned to look for cracks. As a case officer, you learned to turn people into channels. As a senior officer, you learned to doubt everything. As an illegal, you learned to vanish. As a station chief, you learned to choose what truth would be allowed upward. As headquarters, you learned the war was also internal. As director, you learned secrecy becomes its own country. And then, one day, the world changes. A wall comes down, a flag is lowered, a government dissolves. A war ends without a surrender. People in the street celebrate history. You don't celebrate. You sit in a quiet room and realize something you've avoided for decades. You were trained to live in permanent conflict. And now the conflict is over, at least on paper. But you are still wired for it. You still scan faces. You still mistrust silence. You still hear meaning in footsteps behind you. You still measure what you say, even to people who love you. Because the real cost of espionage was never the danger. It was the slow, professional destruction of the person you might have been if you didn't learn so early that survival depends on never being fully known. That's what it was like. Not glamour, not constant action. Just a ladder of ranks that promoted you from idealism to technique to suspicion to power until you reached the top and discovered the final secret. The Cold War wasn't just fought between nations. It was fought inside the people paid to fight it.